Hi, beautiful, great and loyal story family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter's Stories. With a shattered heart and tears in my eyes, I come to you today with the most painful words I've ever had to say. I have to step away from YouTube for a while. My health is failing me, my heart is not well, and the doctors have told me I need to rest. Yesterday, as I was telling you a story, I felt a sharp pain in my heart. I tried to push through, but I couldn't. I had to stop. And in that moment I realized, I can't keep ignoring what my body is telling me. I need to take care of myself so that one day I can return to you stronger. But my beautiful family, this is not goodbye. My stories, my love, my soul, nothing in this world can take that away. No matter what happens, my stories will never stop. While I take this time to heal, my student, my brother, James Peter, will be here to continue my stories. But he is not replacing me. He is honoring me. He will bring my stories to you with the same love, emotions, and deep respect that I have always given. He has been by my side, learning from me, understanding the heart of every word, and I trust him with my whole soul to carry this journey forward. Please, trust him as you trust me. Love him as you love me. The voice may be different, but the heart behind these stories will always be mine. James will carry on this journey with you, making sure that the love we have built never fades. Promise me, my family, promise me that you will stand by him, that you will keep this love alive, and that you will wait for me. Because no matter how long it takes, I will return. I will come back stronger, ready to pour my heart into every story once again. Until then, feel my presence in every story. My prayers, my love, and my soul will always be with you. God bless you all. I love you more than words can ever express.
Hi, my beautiful family. How are you all? I know how much you love Mr. Peter, and I understand that no one can truly fill the space he holds in your hearts. But he has entrusted me with a big responsibility to keep you entertained until he returns. I am just an artist, and maybe you've heard my voice before on YouTube. I can't be Mr. Peter, but I promise to give my best and make every story worth your time. So please, my beautiful family, don't forget to share your thoughts after watching, and most importantly, don't skip this story. Just give me one chance to prove myself. Now, let's begin the story. Orson King stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office. The New York skyline spread before him like a kingdom. At 35, he had everything money could buy, except faith in others. The Forbes magazine on his desk featured his face, naming him one of the most eligible bachelors in America. He scoffed at the title, knowing the women who pursued him were interested only in his wealth and status, not the man he truly was. The empire he had built from his father's already successful company had tripled in value under his leadership, making King Enterprises a force to be reckoned with in the business world. Yet, for all his success, a hollowness echoed within him, a void no amount of money or power could fill. "Mr. King, your father is here to see you." His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, interrupting his thoughts. Orson clenched his jaw, his broad shoulders tensing beneath his perfectly tailored suit. These visits always ended the same way, with his father's disappointment and his own stubborn refusal to give in to familial expectations that felt like chains around his freedom. He briefly considered declining the meeting, but knew his father would simply find another way to corner him. "Send him in," he replied tersely, steeling himself for the inevitable confrontation. Gerald King entered without knocking, impeccably dressed as always, his silver hair and commanding presence a preview of what Orson might look like in 30 years. The older man's eyes held a familiar disappointment as he took in his son's rigid posture, recognizing the walls that had been erected long ago. "The board meeting went well," Gerald said, settling into one of the leather chairs across from Orson's desk without waiting for an invitation. Though several members expressed concerns about the future of the company, specifically about the lack of a clear succession plan. His words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. "I assume this is about finding me a wife again," Orson said coldly, turning away from the window to face his father, his dark eyes revealing nothing of the turmoil beneath. "You've been beating this dead horse for years. I'm not interested in marriage." The word itself left a bitter taste in his mouth, memories of betrayal rising unbidden. His mother walking out on a 5-year-old Orson, choosing another man over her own son. That abandonment had taught him the most crucial lesson of his life. Trusting others, especially women, was a weakness he couldn't afford. "You need an heir, Orson," his father pressed, leaning forward, his voice taking on the persuasive tone he typically reserved for difficult business negotiations. "King Enterprises hasn't survived 5 generations to end with you. Our shareholders need stability, continuity. They need to know that what we've built will endure beyond our lifetimes." Gerald's gaze softened momentarily, a rare glimpse of the father beneath the businessman. "And frankly, son, I worry about you. This solitary existence you've chosen, it's not healthy. Your mother—" "Don't." Orson's voice cut like ice through the room, his hand raised to halt his father's words. "Don't mention her." The tension in the office thickened, the ghost of his mother's betrayal hanging between them like an open wound that 30 years had failed to heal. Gerald sighed heavily, the weight of his son's pain visible in the slump of his shoulders, a rare moment of vulnerability from a man who prided himself on strength. They remained in silence for several heartbeats, the magnificent city below them continuing its relentless pace, oblivious to their private drama. After his father left, Orson poured himself 2 fingers of scotch, the amber liquid burning a familiar path down his throat as he contemplated his options. His father wasn't entirely wrong. The company did need an heir, someone to carry on the King legacy. But marriage was out of the question. He'd seen too many of his peers trapped in loveless unions for the sake of appearances or tradition. He needed a more practical solution, one that would satisfy the board without requiring him to trust a woman with his heart or his future. Setting down his empty glass with decision, he reached for his phone and called his lawyer. "I want a contract drawn up," he stated without preamble, "for a surrogate mother." As night fell over New York, Orson's mind was calculating, planning, weighing the variables of his new strategy. He didn't need a wife. He needed a solution, a business arrangement with clear terms and conditions, defined exits, and limited emotional exposure. A child would secure the King line and satisfy the board's concerns about succession, while allowing him to maintain the control and distance he required. The plan was forming, clinical, pragmatic, and safe. What he didn't account for was the possibility that some variables couldn't be controlled, that some arrangements had a way of developing in unexpected directions, and that sometimes the heart had plans of its own that no contract could contain. Chapter 2: The Woman Who Wouldn't Give Up. Faith Juniper stared at the final notice from the bank, her hands trembling slightly as she placed it on her small office desk. The rich brown of her skin contrasted with the stark white of the paper bearing news that threatened to dismantle everything she had built. 3 years of pushing against every obstacle, of proving wrong every investor who had looked at a young black woman with doubt in their eyes. And now Juniper Organics was slipping through her fingers like sand. Her natural skincare line, born from her parents' wisdom and her own determination, had been gaining traction until her main investor pulled out unexpectedly, citing market uncertainties, though Faith suspected it had more to do with the competitor who had suddenly taken interest in her investor's other ventures. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows of her modest office above her storefront in Brooklyn, casting a golden glow over shelves lined with her products. Elegant glass bottles filled with formulations that combined her father's scientific knowledge with her mother's traditional remedies passed down through generations. Each label bore the logo she had designed herself, a juniper tree with roots that formed the initials of her parents' names. Faith ran her fingers through her meticulously maintained locks, some falling just past her shoulders, adorned with the copper cuffs her mother had given her before the accident. $200,000. That's what she needed to keep everything afloat, to honor her parents' memory, to prove that their belief in her hadn't been misplaced. Her phone rang. The bank manager again. The third call today. Faith let it go to voicemail as she walked to the window, looking down at the bustling Brooklyn street below. She had chosen this location carefully, wanting to bring high-quality, natural products to a community that rarely saw businesses like hers, to create something beautiful and healing in the neighborhood she loved. The workshop behind her office held shelves of product, her dream bottled and labeled, ready for customers that might never come if she couldn't secure new funding. "We'll figure this out," Faith whispered to herself, a habit she'd developed after losing her parents in a car accident 5 years ago. As an only child with no remaining family, she'd grown accustomed to being her own support system, to speaking affirmations into existence when no one else was there to offer them. Later that evening, her best friend Mia appeared at her door with takeout containers of jerk chicken and rice, the spicy aroma filling Faith's apartment above the shop. The familiar scents of Scotch bonnet peppers, allspice, and thyme reminded Faith of Sunday afternoons in her childhood home, when her mother would prepare traditional Jamaican dishes while singing along to Bob Marley, her father joining in with his deep baritone as he helped chop vegetables. Mia's presence was a comfort, as it had been since they were roommates in college, both of them navigating spaces where they were often the only women of color. "I brought sustenance," Mia announced, setting the food on Faith's small dining table, her eyes taking in Faith's exhausted expression. "And before you say you're not hungry, remember I've seen you survive on nothing but coffee and determination before, and it wasn't pretty." Faith managed a small smile, grateful for her friend's refusal to treat her with the pitying glances others had been giving her as rumors of Juniper Organics' financial troubles spread through their business circle. After they had eaten, Mia's expression turned serious as she pulled out her tablet. "I might have found a solution," she said hesitantly, her fingers hovering over the screen. "But it's unconventional. And before you say no, just hear me out completely." Faith raised an eyebrow, setting down her fork, curious despite the wariness that Mia's tone invoked. She had considered every conventional option already: bank loans, crowdfunding, taking on partners. But her credit was overextended, and potential partners wanted too much control over her formulations, asking her to cut costs in ways that would compromise the quality and integrity she had built her brand upon. Mia slid her tablet across the table. It displayed a confidential advertisement seeking a surrogate mother for a high-profile businessman. The compensation listed made Faith's eyes widen. $500,000. "This is crazy," Faith said, pushing the tablet away, the concept too outlandish to contemplate. Her mind flashed to her mother's voice, always practical, yet ambitious. "There are many paths to success, Faith, but never take one that costs you your dignity." She had made it this far without compromising her values. Could she consider something so intimate, so life-altering, simply for financial stability? "Crazier than losing everything you've built," Mia countered, her voice gentle but insistent as she pushed the tablet back toward Faith. "Look, I'm not saying it's an easy choice, but you've tried everything else. This could give you the breathing room to not just save Juniper Organics, but take it to the next level. And," she hesitated, "you've always said you wanted children someday. Maybe not like this, but—" Faith stared at the ceiling, considering the unthinkable. Her business wasn't just a company, it was her parents' legacy. After their death, creating Juniper Organics had been her way of keeping them alive, of honoring her father's scientific brilliance and her mother's healing wisdom. What wouldn't she do to preserve that? "Who is this businessman, anyway?" Faith asked finally, her curiosity outweighing her initial rejection as she picked up the tablet again, scrolling through the sparse details. The advertisement was clearly designed to limit information while attracting suitable candidates. University-educated women in good health, between 25 and 35. No family history of genetic disorders. "That's the thing," Mia replied, a hint of excitement in her voice despite the gravity of the conversation. "It's Orson King." Faith's head snapped up at the name, recognition immediate. Everyone in New York's business circles knew of King Enterprises and its ruthlessly successful CEO. Orson King was legendary not just for his business acumen, but for his cold demeanor and unapologetic standards of perfection. Faith had seen him once at a business conference, commanding the room with an arrogance that both impressed and irritated her. The thought of entering any kind of arrangement with such a man sent a shiver of apprehension down her spine, yet she couldn't deny the tiny spark of intrigue that accompanied it. Chapter 3. The Deal. The King. Enterprise's headquarters intimidated even from the outside, 90 floors of glass and steel reaching toward the sky, the building itself a testament to the power and wealth of the man who commanded it. Faith tugged nervously at the hem of her simple navy dress as she approached the entrance, thankful she had chosen to wear her hair in a neat updo adorned with one of her mother's copper lock cuffs, a small talisman of strength from her Jamaican heritage. The familiar weight of the family heirloom against her temple gave her confidence as she prepared to enter a world far removed from the warm, vibrant community of her Brooklyn neighborhood. A week had passed since Mia had shown her the advertisement, a week of sleepless nights and endless internal debates, of researching Orson King beyond what business magazines reported. The man's reputation was formidable, brilliant but ruthless, demanding excellence from everyone around him while maintaining a distance that bordered on coldness. Now, standing in the shadow of his empire, Faith's resolve wavered for a moment before she steeled herself, drawing on the strength that had carried her through every other challenge in her life. The receptionist eyed her with a barely concealed skepticism that Faith had encountered all too often in spaces not designed with women like her in mind. "Your name, please," the woman asked, her gaze sliding over Faith's appearance with a calculation that seemed to find her lacking. Faith straightened her shoulders, meeting the receptionist's eyes directly. "Faith Juniper, I have an appointment with Mr. King." She kept her voice even, professional, though her heart hammered against her ribs with an intensity that threatened to betray her outward calm. The woman checked her computer, seeming surprised to find Faith's name actually listed. "68th floor. Mr. Rivera will meet you there." Faith nodded her thanks, stepping into the elevator with a strange feeling that she was crossing a threshold from which there would be no easy return. 20 minutes later, Faith sat in a stark conference room facing Orson King and his lawyer, the panoramic views of Manhattan spreading out beyond the windows, doing little to ease the tension that filled the space. Orson hadn't spoken a single word to her yet, assessing her coldly from behind a mask of indifference, while his lawyer, Mr. Rivera, explained the terms of what could only be described as the most unusual business proposition Faith had ever encountered. Her business degree from Howard University had prepared her for many negotiations, but nothing quite like this. The commodification of her body wrapped in legal terminology that somehow made it sound both clinical and reasonable. 9 months of pregnancy, full medical coverage, and complete confidentiality, Rivera droned, sliding papers across the polished table toward her. "Upon successful delivery, the final payment will be transferred to your account. Mr. King requires no further contact after the child is born. All parental rights will be relinquished." Faith listened, trying to maintain her composure as the reality of what she was considering crashed over her in waves. Each word from the lawyer's mouth added weight to her shoulders, each requirement another link in a chain that would bind her to this man and this child for nearly a year of her life. She glanced up to find Orson watching her, his dark eyes unreadable, assessing her reaction with an intensity that made her both uncomfortable and strangely determined to reveal nothing of her inner turmoil. "And the conception?" Faith asked, forcing the word past lips that suddenly felt dry, her gaze steady despite the heat rising to her cheeks. It was the question that had kept her awake most nights, the most intimate aspect of an arrangement that already felt invasive. Rivera cleared his throat, clearly prepared for this inquiry. "Clinical, of course. We have arrangements with a discreet fertility clinic that—" "No," Orson spoke for the first time, his voice deep and commanding, cutting through his lawyer's explanation with the ease of a man accustomed to being the final authority. Faith's eyes snapped to his, startled by both his interruption and the unexpected direction. "I don't trust doctors with this. It will be natural." The bluntness of his statement hung in the air between them, Faith momentarily stunned into silence by the implication. She had prepared herself for clinical detachment, for the sterility of medical procedures. Not for this, not for the intimacy Orson was so casually proposing, as if discussing nothing more significant than a lunch order. The lawyer looked uncomfortable, shooting a glance at his client that suggested this deviation hadn't been part of their preparation. Faith felt her heart hammering in her chest, her mouth suddenly dry as she processed what was being proposed. "One night," Orson continued, his gaze never leaving her face, watching for her reaction with an intensity that seemed to evaluate her worth, based on how she handled this unexpected term. "Then you live in my guest house until delivery, all your needs provided for, of course." There was no emotion in his voice, no acknowledgement of the enormity of what he was suggesting. To him, this was merely another business transaction, a means to an end, with Faith herself nothing more than a necessary component in his larger plan. "And my business? I need to maintain operations," Faith began, determined to assert some control over the conversation, to remind both men that she wasn't simply a vessel, but a person with responsibilities and dreams of her own. Orson cut her off again, clearly unaccustomed to having his terms questioned. "You can work remotely," he stated, making it sound like a generous concession rather than a basic necessity, "but your priority is a healthy pregnancy." The unspoken message was clear. Her business, her passion, her life's work was secondary to her primary function in this arrangement. Faith felt a flare of indignation rise within her, threatening to end the meeting then and there. But the image of the final notice from the bank flashed in her mind, along with the faces of her employees who depended on Juniper Organics for their livelihoods. "I want half the payment up front," Faith stated, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice, with her ability to maintain eye contact with Orson despite the intimidating aura he projected across the table. "To save my business." It was a bold counter, perhaps even reckless given the power imbalance in the room, but Faith had spent her life navigating spaces where the odds were stacked against her. This was no different. Orson studied her, his expression inscrutable, his eyes calculating as if recalibrating his assessment of her. The silence stretched between them, neither willing to break it first, a test of wills that Faith refused to lose despite the anxiety coiling in her stomach. "You'll get enough to keep your business afloat initially," Orson finally replied, each word measured and precise. 200,000. The rest comes after successful conception. Each subsequent month that passes without conception reduces your final payment by 20%. His tone made it clear this was his final offer, the furthest he was willing to bend. Faith processed the terms, recognizing that while not ideal, they would give her the immediate relief she needed. "Do we have a deal, Miss Juniper?" Orson asked, extending his hand across the table, his expression betraying nothing of his thoughts. Faith looked at his outstretched hand, thinking of her parents, of their dream she carried, of the impossible choice before her. She took his hand, noting it was warm despite everything, solid and strong like the man himself. "We have a deal, Mr. King," she replied, sealing her fate with a handshake that represented both salvation and surrender, neither of them aware of how profoundly this business arrangement would change them both. Chapter 4. Cold Hearts, Warm Bodies. The night of conception was set for exactly 2 weeks later, the optimal time according to Faith's cycle. In the intervening days, she had arranged for her assistant manager to oversee daily operations at the store, had transferred her workshop essentials to a small storage unit, and had endured an exhaustive medical examination that left no aspect of her health unscrutinized. The initial payment had been transferred to her business account the day after signing the contract, the sudden influx of funds bringing immediate relief from the most pressing financial pressures. Faith had spent hours on the phone with her suppliers, renegotiating payment terms, securing the raw materials she needed to fulfill pending orders. The work had been a welcome distraction from the reality of what awaited her, from the magnitude of the commitment she had made to a man who viewed her as nothing more than a means to an end. As the appointed evening approached, Faith found herself torn between practical preparation and emotional turmoil. She had expected to feel only anxiety or reluctance, but to her surprise, she also experienced an unwelcome flutter of anticipation when she thought of Orson. Despite his cold demeanor, there was something undeniably magnetic about him, a focused intensity, a quiet confidence that she had glimpsed during their meetings. She'd caught herself several times remembering the warmth of his hand during their handshake, the rare moments when his mask of indifference had slipped to reveal something more complex beneath. These thoughts troubled her, reminders that physical attraction could complicate what needed to remain a straightforward business arrangement. Faith pushed such thoughts aside as she prepared for the evening, choosing comfortable but attractive sleepwear, applying light makeup, practical decisions, she told herself, to make an awkward situation more manageable. Nothing more. Faith arrived at Orson's penthouse precisely at 8 o'clock, clutching her overnight bag like a shield, the soft leather somehow inadequate protection against the vulnerability of her position. The doorman had been expecting her, escorting her to a private elevator that opened directly into Orson's living space. The penthouse spread before her, a study in monochromatic luxury. All sleek lines and minimalist furnishings in shades of gray, black, and white. The space was impeccably designed but devoid of personal touches. No photos, no mementos, no evidence that it was a home rather than a showroom. It was the living space of a man who valued order and control above comfort, who kept the world at a carefully maintained distance. Orson himself appeared from what Faith presumed was his home office, dressed not in the sharp business suit she had expected, but in dark jeans and a charcoal sweater that softened his appearance without diminishing his inherent authority. "You're punctual," he observed, the statement neither a compliment nor criticism, merely an acknowledgement of fact. Faith nodded, unsure how to respond to such a neutral opening, how to behave in this bizarre situation that no etiquette book had ever addressed. "Would you like a drink?" Orson asked, his tone businesslike as he moved toward a bar area in the corner of the vast living room. The question felt absurdly normal given the circumstances, as if they were business associates about to discuss a merger, rather than two strangers preparing for the most intimate of encounters. "No alcohol," Faith replied, setting her bag down carefully. "Not if we're trying to, you know." She couldn't quite bring herself to name their purpose explicitly, the clinical language of the contract suddenly inadequate in the reality of his home, in the anticipation that hung heavy in the air between them. A ghost of a smile touched Orson's lips, the first hint of genuine expression she had seen from him. "Orange juice, then," he offered, and Faith nodded, grateful for something to occupy her hands. They sat in uncomfortable silence in the living area, sipping their drinks, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a spectacular view of the city lights spread out below them like stars reflected in dark water. Faith noticed Orson's eyes assessing her when he thought she wasn't looking, cataloging details with the same precision he likely applied to business acquisitions. "Why me?" Faith finally asked, breaking the silence that threatened to suffocate her with its weight. "There must have been hundreds of applicants for your position." She chose the word deliberately, a subtle reminder that despite the intimate nature of their arrangement, this was still, at its core, a business transaction. Orson set down his glass, considering her question with the same careful deliberation he seemed to apply to everything. "Your medical history is impeccable," he began, his tone matter-of-fact. "No family history of genetic disorders that we could identify. You're clearly intelligent, with a business of your own that demonstrates drive and competence. You have an excellent educational background, and you're—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, weighing them for potential offense, aesthetically suitable. Faith couldn't help but laugh, the sound surprising both of them as it broke the tension in the room. "That might be the least romantic compliment I've ever received," she said, shaking her head at the absurdity of their situation. Orson's expression remained serious, though something in his eyes suggested he wasn't entirely immune to the humor she found. "This isn't about romance," he replied with a directness that bordered on coldness. "It's about genetics and practicality. I needed a surrogate who would contribute favorable characteristics to ensure a healthy, intelligent child. You fit those requirements." The clinical assessment should have offended her, perhaps, but Faith found herself appreciating his honesty, preferring it to any pretense of sentiment that would have rung false from a man so clearly uncomfortable with emotional displays. The conversation stalled again after his pronouncement, both of them acutely aware of what was to come, but unable to find a natural bridge from discussion to action. Faith studied him surreptitiously as the silence lengthened, his strong jawline, the intensity in his dark eyes, the way his custom cashmere sweater fit his athletic frame with a precision that spoke of significant wealth. In another context, under different circumstances, she might have found him attractive. In this one, he both intrigued and intimidated her, a complex mixture of reactions she had no framework for processing. "Shall we get this over with?" Orson finally asked, standing abruptly, the question as direct as everything else about him. The bluntness of it sent a jolt through Faith, reality crashing back after the strange limbo of their awkward small talk. "Just like that?" Faith asked, unable to keep the surprise from her voice, unprepared for the transition, despite knowing it was the entire purpose of her presence in his home. Orson looked down at her, his expression unreadable in the dimmed lighting of the penthouse. "Did you expect candlelight and rose petals, Miss Juniper?" His voice held a trace of mockery. "This is a transaction, not a seduction." The words stung despite their truth, despite Faith's own attempts to maintain emotional distance from the arrangement. She stood, drawing on every ounce of dignity she possessed, determined not to show how his dismissive tone affected her. "I have a name," she said firmly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "It's Faith. And while this may be just business to you, it's my body we're discussing. A little respect for that fact wouldn't be misplaced." Something flickered in Orson's eyes, surprise, perhaps, that she would stand up to him when most people seemed to either fear or defer to him automatically. The moment stretched between them, charged with an unexpected tension that wasn't entirely unpleasant. What happened next surprised them both. Orson led her to his bedroom, a space as meticulously ordered as the rest of his home, dominated by a king-sized bed with dark sheets. But when he reached for her, his touch was not the mechanical gesture she had braced herself for. Despite the cold beginning, their bodies seemed to have different ideas about how the evening should proceed. What was supposed to be clinical and brief became something neither had anticipated. Orson's hands, initially hesitant, grew confident as they explored the curves of her body, his breath catching when her skin was finally revealed to him. Faith, determined to remain emotionally uninvolved, found herself responding to his touch with an intensity that shocked her, her body arching instinctively toward his. There was no love between them, no tender emotion to soften the encounter, but there was a raw chemistry that neither had expected, a physical compatibility that transformed what should have been a mechanical act into something that left them both breathless and silent in its aftermath. They lay apart afterward, the space between them on the king-sized bed, a carefully maintained boundary, despite the intimacy they had just shared, each lost in private thoughts about what had transpired. "The guest house is ready for you," Orson said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between them, his voice carefully neutral, as if trying to re-establish the professional distance that had momentarily dissolved. "You can move in tomorrow. My assistant will arrange for transportation of whatever you need." Faith stared at the ceiling, her mind struggling to process the complexity of her situation, the strangeness of lying naked in a stranger's bed, with the potential of new life already possibly taking root within her. The reality of what she had agreed to suddenly felt overwhelming, the full weight of 9 months stretching before her like an unmapped road. "And if I'm not pregnant?" she asked, voicing the question that had been lurking at the edges of her mind since she signed the contract. "Then we try again next month," Orson replied matter-of-factly, his tone making it clear that the unexpected passion of their encounter had not changed the fundamental nature of their arrangement. "Until it works." The simplicity of his answer belied the complexity of what it would mean. More nights like this one, more moments of unexpected connection, followed by deliberate distance. Faith closed her eyes briefly, wondering what her parents would think of the path she had chosen, whether they would understand the impossible choice she had made to preserve their legacy. When she opened her eyes again, she found Orson watching her, something unreadable in his expression, a question he didn't voice. The moment passed quickly as he rose from the bed, efficient even in this most private of moments, already shifting back into the role of businessman rather than lover. Faith watched him move around the room, the powerful lines of his body outlined in the dim light, and wondered if there was more to Orson King than the cold, calculating exterior he presented to the world, and whether the coming months would reveal the man behind the mask. Chapter 5. Waiting Game. The first month in Orson's guest house passed in a blur. The property, a stately brownstone that most New Yorkers could only dream of affording, seemed to emphasize Faith's isolation. She had turned one of the bedrooms into a makeshift office, directing Juniper Organics remotely. The initial payment had saved her business from collapse, giving her breathing room to strategize. Orson was rarely present, calling every few days to ask clinical questions about her health and potential symptoms. Their conversations never acknowledged the unexpected heat that had flared between them that first night. Faith had told only Mia about the arrangement, swearing her to secrecy. "So you're living in his guest house while you wait to see if you're pregnant with his baby," Mia had summarized during a hushed phone call. "And you haven't seen him since that night?" Faith couldn't fully articulate the strangeness of her situation, living in luxury while waiting to see if her body had fulfilled its contractual obligation. At the 1-month mark, Faith took the pregnancy test alone. When the single line appeared, she felt a complex mixture of relief and disappointment that made no rational sense. "I see," Orson replied after she called with the news. "You'll try again," he added, the statement a reminder of their contract and the reduced payment with each unsuccessful month. The second attempt was scheduled with clinical precision. This time, Orson came to the guest house with a bottle of expensive wine. "I thought this might make things easier," he said. The implication was clear. This encounter was a task to be completed, one that might benefit from lowered inhibitions. Faith declined, determined to maintain her dignity. The evening unfolded with even more detachment than their first encounter, Orson treating the entire process like a business meeting. Faith couldn't help feeling used, a means to an end rather than a person. When it was over, Orson left without spending the night. Another month passed. Faith threw herself into her work, developing a new line of hair products specifically formulated for textured hair like her own. When the second test came back negative, she felt the same bewildering mix of emotions, amplified by the knowledge that her value in their contract was diminishing. Orson's voice was noticeably colder when she called with the news. The third month brought tension to a breaking point. Orson appeared unexpectedly one evening, catching Faith during a video conference. 3 months, he said without preamble, his voice tight with barely contained irritation. 3 months of failure. Faith stepped back, allowing him in despite her instinct to slam the door in his face. "I'm doing everything the doctors suggested," she replied. "Sometimes these things take time." "Time is money, Ms. Juniper," he said coldly, "and you are costing me both." The accusation stung more than Faith wanted to admit. "I'm not doing this intentionally," she retorted. "Do you think I enjoy living in this beautiful cage, waiting for my body to do something it clearly isn't ready to do?" Orson's gaze swept dismissively around the room. "Maybe you're infertile. Maybe you're just here to enjoy the benefits without delivering results." Faith's hand connected with his cheek before she could stop herself. "Get out," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm not your machine that's malfunctioning. I'm a human being." The next morning, Faith awoke to find a bouquet of calla lilies, her favorite flower, with a brief note. "Try again. Please." That afternoon, she glimpsed Orson through the window, conducting business in the garden. Their eyes met across the distance, and instead of quickly looking away, he held her gaze before offering a small nod, an acknowledgement of her humanity, perhaps even respect for her willingness to stand her ground. Faith wondered what it would take to break through the walls he had built, and whether she wanted to try, or if she should keep her own walls firmly in place. Chapter 6. Unexpected News. The fourth month brought a shift in their dynamic. After the confrontation and the silent apology of flowers, Orson maintained his distance, but with a subtle difference that Faith couldn't quite define. His calls remained brief and focused on her health, but the edge of coldness had softened, replaced by something that, while not warmth, at least resembled basic courtesy. When the time came for their fourth attempt, Faith steeled herself for another evening of clinical detachment, of being treated like a means to an end rather than a partner in this strange endeavor. Orson arrived at the scheduled time, but instead of proceeding directly to the bedroom as he had during their previous encounter, he handed her a small bag from a local bakery. "The housekeeper mentioned you like these," he said, his tone carefully neutral as Faith peered inside to find chocolate croissants from a renowned French patisserie. The gesture wasn't exactly personal. He had delegated even this small kindness to his staff's observations, but it represented an acknowledgement of her as a person with preferences and tastes, a tiny step away from treating her as merely a contractual obligation. The encounter that followed was different from their previous attempts, not romantic by any conventional standard, but no longer coldly mechanical either. A new awareness existed between them, a recognition that whatever happened, they were bound together in this peculiar intimacy for months to come, that perhaps allowing for some basic human connection wouldn't compromise the fundamental business nature of their arrangement. When it was over, Orson lingered longer than he had before, making awkward but genuine attempts at conversation about Juniper Organics, asking questions that suggested he had researched her business beyond the basic financial assessment his team had initially provided. Faith found herself responding cautiously, protective of her passion project, but surprised by his apparent interest. When he finally left, the atmosphere between them had shifted into something Faith couldn't quite name. Not friendship, certainly not romance, but perhaps a truce of sorts, an agreement to acknowledge each other's humanity within the boundaries of their unusual contract. 2 weeks later, Faith stared at the positive pregnancy test, a mixture of elation and terror washing over her at the implications of those two pink lines. She took a second test to confirm, hands shaking slightly as she waited for the result, the bathroom of the guest house suddenly feeling too small to contain the magnitude of what was happening. When the second test showed the same clear positive result, Faith sat on the edge of the bathtub, breathing deeply, trying to process the reality that she was now carrying Orson King's child. She was pregnant. Their arrangement had worked. Her body was now home to new life, a physical manifestation of their business deal. The clinical language of their contract seemed suddenly inadequate in the face of this profound biological reality. After gathering her composure, Faith called Orson, her voice slightly unsteady despite her best efforts. "It's positive," she said simply when he answered. "2 tests. Both positive." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the silence stretching between them filled with unspoken implications and reactions. "You're certain?" Orson finally asked, his typically controlled voice betraying a slight crack that Faith might have missed if she hadn't become attuned to the subtle variations in his speech over the past months. When she confirmed again, he cleared his throat. "I'll schedule an appointment with the obstetrician for tomorrow. I'll pick you up at 9. The efficiency of his response was predictable, but Faith thought she detected something new beneath the businesslike exterior, a hint of genuine emotion, perhaps even excitement, quickly masked by his habitual control. After ending the call, Faith placed her hand gently on her still flat stomach. The reality of what was growing inside her, still abstract but undeniable, this was no longer theoretical, no longer a future possibility. It was happening, and neither she nor Orson had fully prepared for how it would feel when their contractual arrangement transformed into the tangible reality of pregnancy. The doctor's appointment the following day confirmed what neither of them had expected. Faith was carrying twins. "Twins?" Orson repeated, looking genuinely stunned for the first time since Faith had met him, his usual mask of impassive control slipping to reveal wide-eyed surprise as he stared at the ultrasound screen where 2 distinct heartbeats were visible. The obstetrician, an older woman with a warm manner that put Faith immediately at ease, smiled at their matching expressions of shock. "Congratulations," she said, clearly misinterpreting their relationship as that of an excited couple rather than business associates. "2 strong heartbeats. Everything looks perfect for this stage of development." Faith felt Orson's eyes on her, his gaze intense with something she couldn't read, something beyond the surprise of unexpected news. When she looked at him, a moment of unguarded connection passed between them, a shared recognition of how their carefully planned arrangement had already begun deviating from the script, delivering more than either had bargained for. In the car afterward, Orson was unusually quiet, his typical confidence replaced by a contemplative silence as his driver navigated through midday Manhattan traffic. Faith studied his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows as he processed this new development. "Is this a problem?" she finally asked, her voice soft but direct, one hand unconsciously resting on her abdomen where 2 new lives were taking form. The contract didn't specify multiple children. She was prepared for various reactions, frustration at the complication, perhaps, or a business-like adjustment to their arrangement. What she wasn't prepared for was the expression that crossed Orson's face when he turned to her, a complex mixture of emotions that included what looked remarkably like vulnerability. "No, it's not a problem," he replied after a moment, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "It's more than I hoped for." The simple admission contained layers Faith couldn't fully decipher, glimpses of the man beneath the carefully constructed facade of the ruthless CEO. Before she could respond, Orson continued, his tone shifting back toward practicality, though lacking its usual edge of coldness. "This changes things. Twins are higher risk than single pregnancies. You'll need more comprehensive care." His concern seemed to extend beyond the pragmatic interest in protecting his investment, hinting at something more fundamentally human. Faith watched him as he made calls, rearranging his schedule to accommodate longer doctor appointments, instructing his assistant to research the best maternal specialists for twin pregnancies. The efficiency remained, but it was now tinged with what appeared to be genuine care for her well-being and that of the babies she carried. That evening, Orson insisted she move from the guest house into the main house. "You need proper care," he stated as they sat in his sleek, modern kitchen, where he had surprisingly prepared dinner himself, a simple but perfectly executed meal that revealed yet another unexpected facet of this complex man. "Twins are higher risk. The guest house is too isolated if you need assistance." Faith hesitated, uncomfortably aware that moving into Orson's personal space would blur the already complicated boundaries of their arrangement. The guest house had provided a necessary physical and emotional distance, a reminder that their connection was temporary and contractual rather than intimate and lasting. "I'm doing fine in the guest house," she countered, pushing the food around on her plate, suddenly not as hungry as she had been moments before. The thought of living under the same roof as Orson, of navigating shared spaces and daily interactions with a man she still didn't fully understand, filled her with a mixture of apprehension and something else she wasn't ready to examine too closely. "My father will be visiting next week," Orson added unexpectedly, changing the subject with characteristic abruptness. "He wants to see how the arrangement is progressing." The hesitation before arrangement was slight but noticeable, a tiny indicator of how their situation had evolved beyond the clinical terms of their initial contract. Faith looked up in surprise, this being the first mention of Gerald King visiting since their agreement began. "He knows about me?" "About the pregnancy?" she asked, suddenly conscious of how she might be perceived by the King patriarch as a transaction, a necessity, or something worse. Orson nodded, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly. "He knows the essentials, not all the details." He studied her face for a moment before adding, "My father can be challenging. His views on relationships are even more cynical than mine, shaped by his own experiences. Having you in the main house would present a more united front." The admission revealed another layer to Orson's request, not just concern for her physical well-being, but a desire to present their arrangement in a specific light to his father, to shield both of them from whatever judgment Gerald King might bring to their unconventional situation. "This isn't negotiable," Orson replied, but his tone lacked its usual edge of command. There was something almost like pleading beneath the surface of his words, a vulnerability he seemed unwilling or unable to express directly. "I want you closer, for monitoring purposes." The justification was clearly a partial truth at best, an attempt to frame his request in the business-like terms they were both more comfortable with. But Faith sensed there was more to it. Perhaps a genuine concern for her well-being. Perhaps a desire to be more involved in the pregnancy. Perhaps something else entirely that Orson himself didn't fully understand. Faith reluctantly agreed, recognizing the practical advantages even as she worried about the emotional complications such proximity might create. Within days, she was settled into a spacious suite in Orson's home, her belongings arranged by his efficient staff, her new living space more luxurious than anything she had ever experienced, but somehow less comforting than the separate guest house had been. To Faith's surprise, Orson began to take an interest in her pregnancy beyond medical reports and practical arrangements. He insisted on attending every appointment, asked about her comfort levels throughout the day, and even began reading books on expectant fathers, though he never referred to himself as such, maintaining the fiction that this was merely a business arrangement, even as his actions suggested a deeper investment. One night, nearly a week after she had moved into the main house, Faith found him in the library, surrounded by parenting books and medical texts on twin development, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled. his focus so intense he didn't notice her presence until she cleared her throat softly. Orson looked up, momentarily unguarded, a hint of embarrassment crossing his features at being caught in what appeared to be genuine preparation for fatherhood, rather than mere contractual obligation. "Preparing for an exam?" Faith teased gently, the humor an attempt to ease the strange tension that seemed to follow them through the house these days, an acknowledgement of how their relationship was shifting into something neither had anticipated when they signed their carefully worded contract. Orson closed the book he had been studying, a rare vulnerability visible in his expression as he regarded her standing in the doorway, her presence in his home still new enough to seem slightly surreal. "I don't know what I'm doing," he admitted, the confession clearly costing him something in pride, "with any of this." Chapter 7. Shifting Ground. By the 5th month, Faith's body had changed dramatically. The twins made her pregnancy more pronounced than a single baby would have, her slender frame now sporting a clearly visible bump that she alternately cradled protectively and examined with wonder in the mirror. Orson had insisted on having a maternity wardrobe custom-made for her, dismissing her protests about the expense with an impatient wave of his hand. "You represent King Enterprises now," he had said, then seemed to catch himself, adding more softly, "and comfort is essential for a healthy pregnancy." The new clothes were beautiful, designer pieces in rich jewel tones that complemented Faith's deep brown skin. Despite her physical distance from her Brooklyn store, Juniper Organics was thriving. The initial investment had not only saved it from bankruptcy, but positioned it for unexpected growth, with her new line for women of color gaining significant traction in markets that had previously seemed impenetrable. Orson had become surprisingly attentive since the twins' news, insisting on having meals with her, his gaze often lingering on her changing body with an expression that wasn't clinical assessment, but something closer to awe. One evening over dinner, he asked, "Why natural skincare products?" The genuine curiosity in his voice marked a departure from his earlier dismissive attitude toward her business. Faith smiled, warming to her favorite subject, her hands animating her words. "My mother was allergic to most commercial products. Her skin would break out in rashes from ingredients that most people never react to. My father was a chemist. He created formulations for her using traditions from my mother's Caribbean heritage, combined with his scientific knowledge. She found herself sharing stories she hadn't intended to, drawn out by Orson's unexpected interest, by the attentive way he listened without interrupting or checking his phone, as he did during business conversations. After they died in the car accident, I found his notebooks full of formulas. My mother's notes about which plants and ingredients had worked best," Faith continued, her voice softening with memory. "It felt like they had left me a road map." She trailed off, the grief still fresh, despite the years. Orson studied her across the table, something soft entering his usually guarded expression. "You loved them very much," he observed quietly. "They were everything to me," Faith admitted. "Juniper Organics isn't just a business, it's their legacy." Later that week, Orson surprised her by converting one of the spare rooms into a small laboratory for her work, equipped with everything she needed to continue developing formulations. "Your business shouldn't suffer because of our arrangement," he said simply when he showed her the space. The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Faith deeply, suggesting an understanding of her needs that went beyond their contract. As her pregnancy progressed, Faith noticed subtle changes in Orson that others might have missed. He began working from home more often, converting part of his study into a temporary office that allowed him to be present without explicitly acknowledging that he was choosing to be near her. Sometimes she would catch him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, not with calculation but with something that resembled wonder, his gaze lingering on the visible evidence of the new lives growing within her. One afternoon, Faith entered the kitchen to find him speaking quietly with his chef about incorporating more Caribbean-inspired dishes into the menu, clearly drawing from details she had mentioned about her childhood favorites. When he noticed her presence, he didn't try to hide the conversation, instead asking her input in a way that acknowledged her cultural heritage as something valuable rather than incidental. One night, Faith woke to sharp pains that sent fear coursing through her veins. Instinctively, without consideration for their complex relationship, she called out for Orson. He appeared in her doorway almost instantly, dressed in pajama bottoms and a t-shirt, his hair disheveled from sleep, but his eyes instantly alert at the sight of her distress. "What's wrong?" he demanded, crossing to her bedside with two quick strides. Faith clutched her abdomen, fear making her voice tight. "Pain. Something's wrong." Orson was already reaching for his phone, calling his driver while simultaneously helping her sit up, his free hand supporting her back, with a gentleness that belied his usual commanding presence. "Hospital. Now," he stated, his voice leaving no room for argument as he helped her into a robe, his movements efficient but careful. The emergency proved to be false labor, but the doctor warned that Faith needed more rest. On the drive home, Orson was unusually quiet, his profile stern in the dim light of the car's interior. When he finally spoke, his voice held a determination Faith recognized from his business dealings. "I'm hiring a full-time nurse," he announced. Faith felt a flash of irritation at his presumption, at the reminder that despite their evolving relationship, Orson still defaulted to making unilateral decisions. "That's excessive," she protested. "Nothing is excessive when it comes to their safety," Orson replied firmly, his hand moving unconsciously toward her belly before he caught himself and pulled back, the aborted gesture revealing more than perhaps he intended about his growing emotional investment in the pregnancy. That night, as Orson helped her back to her room, Faith stumbled slightly on the plush carpet. His arms caught her, strong and secure, one hand at her waist and the other gently gripping her arm. For a moment, they stood close enough to feel each other's breath. Faith's face tilted up to his, Orson looking down at her with an expression that contained multitudes, concern, certainly, but also something warmer that made Faith's heart beat faster. "Thank you," she whispered, suddenly aware of the heat of his hand through the thin fabric of her nightgown, of the solid strength of his body close to hers. Orson's eyes dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes, the moment stretching between them, taut with possibility. Then, as if remembering himself, he set her gently away, his hands lingering for just a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "Get some rest," he said, his voice rougher than usual, betraying emotions he clearly wished to contain. Faith watched him walk away down the dimly lit hallway, her hand resting on her rounded belly where the twins occasionally made their presence known through gentle movements. Something had shifted between them in that moment in the hallway, something neither of them was ready to acknowledge but which would be impossible to ignore completely. Faith closed her bedroom door, leaning against it as she absorbed the implications of what had just transpired. Not what had happened, but what almost had, and what it revealed about the changing nature of her feelings toward Orson King. She was falling for him, despite all her intentions to keep this arrangement strictly business. The realization was both terrifying and somehow inevitable, like watching storm clouds gather on the horizon, beautiful in their way, but promising turbulence ahead. Chapter 8. Walls Coming Down. The 6th month brought a new dimension to their arrangement. Orson had begun accompanying Faith on walks around the property's secluded garden, insisting fresh air was good for her health and the development of the twins. These walks, initially conducted in awkward silence punctuated by Orson's clinical questions about her physical condition, gradually evolved into something neither had anticipated. Moments of genuine connection where the barriers between them lowered incrementally with each shared conversation. The spring weather had transformed the garden into a riot of color and fragrance, the carefully maintained space offering both beauty and privacy from the outside world that remained unaware of their unusual living situation. Faith found herself looking forward to these daily excursions, to the opportunity to escape the confines of the house and to glimpse more of the complex man behind Orson's carefully maintained facade. "What will you tell them about me?" Faith asked one afternoon as they followed the winding stone path among blooming magnolias, voicing the question that had troubled her for months, but which she had never found the courage to articulate until now. The twins had become increasingly active, their movements no longer the gentle flutters of early pregnancy, but distinct kicks and rolls that Orson sometimes watched with barely concealed fascination when he thought Faith wasn't noticing. Her hand rested protectively on her rounded belly as she asked the question, her dark eyes steady on Orson's face, determined to see his unfiltered reaction to this direct confrontation of their future. Orson's steps faltered, his usual confidence momentarily shaken by the unexpected inquiry. He looked away from her, toward the Manhattan skyline visible beyond the garden walls, his profile strong against the backdrop of blue sky and distant buildings. "I haven't thought that far ahead," he admitted finally, though something in his tone suggested this wasn't entirely true, that perhaps he had considered this question, but had reached no satisfactory answer. "Haven't you?" Faith pressed gently, unwilling to let the moment pass without addressing the reality that would eventually confront them all. "These children will ask someday. They'll want to know who their mother is." She emphasized the word deliberately, a reminder that no matter what legal documents they had signed, biology and human connection couldn't be so easily dismissed. They'll notice they have a black mother when they look in the mirror, when they see features that don't come from you. The observation hung between them, acknowledging the additional complexity their different racial backgrounds would bring to the situation, the questions that would inevitably arise as the twins grew older and more aware of themselves and their origins. A storm passed across Orson's face, conflicting emotions battling for dominance in an expression usually kept carefully neutral. "The contract stipulates," he began, falling back on the legal framework that had defined their relationship from the beginning. "I know what the contract says," Faith interrupted, her voice gentle but firm as they paused beside a stone bench nestled among flowering bushes. She settled onto it, the weight of the twins making even short walks tiring these days. Orson remained standing for a moment before reluctantly joining her, maintaining a careful distance despite the limited space. "But contracts don't account for human hearts, Orson. These babies will have questions someday. They'll want to know about their heritage, about where they come from. Half of their DNA, half of their identity, will come from me." She turned slightly to face him, her expression earnest, wanting him to understand the complexity of what they had created together. Not just new lives, but new identities that would need nurturing and understanding beyond what legal documents could address. "What will you tell them when they ask why their mother isn't in their lives? Will you paint me as someone who abandoned them for money? Will you tell them the truth about our arrangement?" The question seemed to pierce something in Orson's careful armor, reaching parts of him he kept rigorously protected. He stared at his hands, strong and capable in business dealings, but suddenly appearing inadequate in the face of the future responsibilities Faith was forcing him to confront. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sounds of birdsong and distant city noise, with the weight of decisions not yet made but which couldn't be postponed indefinitely. When Orson finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual, stripped of its usual commanding certainty. "I don't know," he confessed, the admission clearly costing him something in pride. "I didn't consider." He trailed off, seeming to struggle with articulating thoughts he had deliberately avoided examining too closely. Faith waited, giving him space to find his words, understanding that for a man like Orson, accustomed to having answers for everything, such uncertainty was deeply uncomfortable. That evening, after dinner had been cleared away and they sat in the comfortable quiet of Orson's rarely used living room, He appeared at the doorway of Faith's adjoining sitting area with an expression that suggested he had reached some kind of decision after hours of internal debate. "I've been thinking about what you said in the garden," he began without preamble, lowering himself into the armchair across from where Faith was reviewing Juniper Organics' latest financial reports. She set aside her tablet, giving him her full attention, recognizing the significance of his voluntarily returning to their earlier conversation rather than allowing it to fade unresolved as he might have done months ago. Orson met her gaze directly, his usual mask of indifference replaced by something more vulnerable, more genuine. Perhaps, perhaps we could modify our arrangement." Faith raised an eyebrow, surprised by this unexpected opening, this willingness to reconsider terms that had seemed immutable when they first signed their contract. "In what way?" she asked cautiously, not wanting to presume his meaning or to push too hard against this fragile new willingness to negotiate. Orson's fingers tapped an irregular rhythm against the arm of his chair, a rare display of nervous energy from a man who typically maintained rigorous physical control. "Visitation rights," he said finally, the words coming with evident difficulty. "After they're born. Not frequently, but occasionally, so they would know you, have some relationship with you. It would be healthier for them, I think." The concession stunned Faith, representing a fundamental shift in how Orson viewed their arrangement. No longer a simple transaction, but a complex human situation with long-term implications for the emotional well-being of the children they had created together. "Why the change of heart?" Faith asked softly, wanting to understand the evolution in his thinking, to gauge how genuine this offer might be rather than a temporary concession he might later regret or rescind. Orson looked away briefly, his gaze falling on the subtle swell of her belly where his children grew, before returning to meet her eyes with unusual directness. "They deserve to know you," he admitted, each word seeming to cost him something in the currency of emotional distance he had traded in for most of his adult life. "You're—" He hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't reveal too much of his changing feelings. "You're not what I expected, Faith." The use of her first name didn't escape her notice, spoken not as a business formality, but with a warmth that suggested genuine regard. It was the first time he had used it since their arrangement began, with such unguarded sincerity, a small but significant indicator of how their relationship had evolved, despite both their efforts to maintain professional detachment. Their relationship continued to shift subtly in the weeks that followed, the rigid boundaries of their initial contract increasingly softened by the daily reality of shared space and shared purpose. Orson began joining Faith for dinner each night, their conversations gradually extending beyond her pregnancy and his business concerns into more personal territories. He spoke with halting reluctance at first, but with increasing openness, of his childhood, of the abandonment that had shaped him, of his father's emotional distance that had taught him to equate vulnerability with weakness, of the defensive walls he had built to protect himself from the kind of pain his mother's departure had inflicted. Faith shared stories of her parents in return, of the close-knit family that had shaped her understanding of love and commitment, of her dreams for Juniper Organics that went beyond financial success to creating something meaningful and lasting in her parents' memory. During her 7th month, Faith awoke one night to find the house unusually quiet, the normal subtle sounds of Orson working late in his study absent. Unable to find a comfortable position for sleep, a familiar discomfort that had been growing more intense in recent days, she wrapped herself in a soft robe and wandered the dimly lit hallways, eventually discovering light spilling from the partially open door of the nursery he had commissioned. Faith paused in the doorway, surprised to find Orson sitting alone in the room, surrounded by the carefully selected furniture and decorations that awaited the twins' arrival. He sat in one of 2 matching rocking chairs, staring at the 2 cribs with an expression of such unguarded vulnerability that Faith almost retreated, feeling as though she had intruded on something deeply private. Earlier that day, they had attended a doctor's appointment where, though the specialist had maintained a reassuring tone, Faith had noticed the slight furrow in her brow while examining the ultrasound. "Your blood pressure is trending higher than I'd like," the doctor had mentioned casually. Too casually, Faith thought. Orson had immediately bombarded her with questions about risks and precautions, revealing a depth of concern that contrasted sharply with his usual controlled demeanor. The doctor had prescribed more rest and additional monitoring, assurances that should have been comforting, but instead planted seeds of worry that Faith could see reflected now in Orson's pensive expression as he sat alone in the nursery, contemplating the empty cribs that awaited their children. Before she could slip away, Orson sensed her presence, though he didn't turn immediately, his voice low in the quiet room. "Couldn't sleep either." Faith entered hesitantly, lowering herself carefully into the second rocking chair beside him, her movements slower and more deliberate as her pregnancy advanced. "The twins have decided night is the perfect time for gymnastics practice," she replied with a small smile, one hand automatically moving to her belly, where one of the babies was indeed active. They sat in companionable silence for several moments, the moonlight filtering through partially drawn curtains, creating patterns across the plush carpet, the carefully painted mural of a world map on one wall, reflecting Orson's hope that his children would grow up with broader horizons than he had experienced in his own restrictive upbringing. "I keep thinking about my father," Orson admitted finally, breaking the silence with unexpected candor. "About the kind of father I'll be." The confession revealed more of Orson's inner thoughts than he typically allowed himself to share, a glimpse of the anxieties that plagued him beneath his confident exterior. Faith studied his profile in the dim light, seeing not the powerful CEO but simply a man confronting the imminent reality of fatherhood with all its attendant uncertainties and responsibilities. "You're already different from him," she observed quietly, her voice gentle in the stillness of the nursery. "You're here. You care. You're preparing." She gestured around the room at the evidence of thought and consideration that had gone into creating this space for children not yet born, but already deeply considered. "Your father never read parenting books or sat in a nursery at midnight, wondering if he was up to the task. The fact that you're doing those things means you're already miles ahead." "Do I know how to care?" Orson asked, the question clearly rhetorical but revealing depths of self-doubt Faith wouldn't have believed him capable of months ago. "I've spent my life avoiding attachments, building a company instead of relationships. I'm not sure I have the capacity for the kind of openness children need." The vulnerability in his admission touched something in Faith, a recognition that beneath the arrogance and control she had initially encountered was a man genuinely concerned about his ability to provide emotional support to his children, aware of his limitations in ways she hadn't given him credit for. Without thinking, she reached for his hand where it rested on the arm of the rocking chair, a gesture of comfort and connection that would have been unthinkable when they first met. Orson's fingers closed around hers, warm and strong, the simple human contact seeming to anchor him in the moment, to provide reassurance that words alone couldn't convey. "Faith," he said her name like he was testing it on his tongue, infusing the single syllable with meanings neither of them were quite ready to articulate. Their eyes met in the moonlit nursery, mutual recognition passing between them of how far they had come from the cold conference room where their arrangement had begun, of how many unexpected dimensions their relationship had developed despite their initial determination to keep it strictly business. "Yes?" Faith responded softly, aware of the charged atmosphere between them, of the way their clasped hands represented a connection that extended beyond their contractual obligations to each other. "I'm glad it was you," Orson said simply, the words hanging in the air between them, weighted with implications neither was ready to explore fully, but which neither could entirely ignore. The statement encompassed more than gratitude for her willing participation in their arrangement. It suggested a recognition that out of all the potential surrogates he might have selected, Faith's particular combination of strength, integrity, and compassion had brought something essential and unexpected into his carefully ordered life. Faith felt something shift inside her at his words, a crystallization of feelings that had been developing for weeks. It wasn't just one thing that had drawn her to this complex man, but a mosaic of moments. The way she had caught him researching natural skincare ingredients to better understand her business. His unexpected gentleness when helping her navigate stairs on days her balance felt precarious. The time she'd awakened from a nap to find him having fallen asleep in a chair nearby, a protective guardian whose vulnerability in sleep revealed the man beneath the armor. Most telling had been the morning she'd mentioned missing her mother's traditional Sunday breakfasts, only to find Orson's chef presenting her with an impeccably researched version of the Caribbean dishes her mother had once prepared, clearly commissioned by a man who listened more carefully than he let on. Faith squeezed his hand gently in response, unable to find words that wouldn't say either too much or too little in the face of this quiet confession. They remained that way for some time, connected by their clasped hands as the moonlight shifted across the nursery floor, each lost in private thoughts about the future that awaited them and the complex feelings that had developed where only a business arrangement was supposed to exist. Chapter 9. The Storm Before the Calm. The 8th month brought serious complications when Faith's blood pressure rose to alarming levels. Preeclampsia is a risk we need to take seriously, the doctor explained, especially with twin pregnancies. The diagnosis transformed Orson overnight. He rearranged his entire business schedule, delegating responsibilities he would previously have insisted only he could handle. The doctor ordered complete bed rest, minimal stress, and constant monitoring. Orson transformed Faith's suite into a medically equipped space, sparing no expense for the best specialists. "You don't need to hover," Faith protested, as Orson checked her blood pressure for the 3rd time in a single afternoon. "The nurses are perfectly capable of doing their jobs." Faith caught his wrist, forcing him to meet her gaze. "You're scared," she said, realization dawning. "You're actually scared." Orson's mask slipped, revealing vulnerability that would have shocked those who knew him only as the ruthless CEO. "If anything happened to you, to the babies," he began, then stopped abruptly. "Nothing will happen," Faith assured him, placing his hand on her rounded belly where one of the twins was moving. "We're stronger than you think." That night, while Faith slept fitfully, Orson sat beside her bed. When she stirred from a nightmare, he took her hand without hesitation. "I'm here," he whispered. "You're not alone." The next morning, Faith awoke to find Orson still there, asleep in the chair, his hand still holding hers. Something broke open inside her, the final defense against what she had been feeling for months. Somewhere between contract negotiations and midnight vigils, Faith had fallen in love with Orson King. Before Faith could process this revelation fully, Gerald King arrived unexpectedly. Orson met his father in the study, deliberately choosing a location away from Faith's suite. "So it's true," Gerald said. "You've been neglecting the business for a surrogate." Orson bristled immediately. "Faith is not just a surrogate," he replied, his voice cold. Gerald's eyebrows shot up. "Faith, is it? Not Ms. Juniper anymore. Interesting development." "What do you want, father?" Orson asked directly. Gerald studied his son. "The board is concerned. You've missed 3 critical meetings. There are rumors about your situation." Orson's jaw tightened. "The babies will be born in a few weeks. The King line continues. Isn't that what you wanted?" Gerald studied his son. "It was, but now I'm concerned about something else entirely. You're developing feelings for this woman." That's none of your business, Orson replied sharply. Gerald sighed. It is when it affects King Enterprises. Need I remind you what happened after your mother left? How your judgment was clouded for years afterward? The reference to those painful years hit Orson like a physical blow. Faith is nothing like her, Orson stated with absolute certainty. All women are the same when it comes to advantage, Gerald said, his voice heavy with bitterness. She came to you for money. She'll leave you for it too, once she has enough. Before Orson could respond, a crash sounded from upstairs. He raced to Faith's room to find her collapsed on the bathroom floor, blood staining her nightgown. The babies, she whispered as Orson knelt beside her. Something's wrong with the babies. As he carried Faith down the stairs, past his father's shocked expression and into the waiting car, Orson was conscious of a perfect clarity, understanding what mattered most to him now. Stay with me, he murmured against Faith's hair as the car sped toward the hospital. I can't do this without you. The admission contained multitudes, acknowledgments of dependency and need that the Orson of 6 months ago would have considered unacceptable weaknesses, but which now felt like essential truths. Chapter 10. New Life. The hospital corridors echoed with the controlled urgency of a medical emergency, the harsh fluorescent lighting casting stark shadows as Faith was rushed into surgery. The medical team moved with practiced efficiency, a choreography of professionalism that contrasted sharply with Orson's barely contained panic as he was directed to the waiting area, suddenly powerless in a situation no amount of money or influence could control. He paced the small private room, unable to sit, unable to focus on anything beyond the terrifying uncertainty of what was happening behind closed doors. Gerald had followed in a separate car, now sitting silently in a corner of the waiting room, his earlier confrontational stance softened by the gravity of the situation, by the unmistakable evidence of his son's emotional investment in Faith and the twins. Time stretched and contracted in the surreal space of crisis, minutes feeling like hours as Orson waited for news. His mind circled obsessively through worst-case scenarios, despite his attempts to focus on positive outcomes, his father's warnings echoing uncomfortably against his own deepest fears of loss and abandonment. He had spent decades building defenses against precisely this kind of vulnerability, constructing his life to minimize emotional risk. Yet here he was, completely exposed, utterly dependent on circumstances beyond his control, his carefully ordered existence hanging on the well-being of a woman he had initially viewed as little more than a means to an end. The irony wasn't lost on him, though he found no comfort in the recognition of how completely his priorities had shifted, of how thoroughly Faith had disrupted the cold efficiency of the life he had designed for himself. Mr. King. A nurse appeared at the doorway, her expression professionally neutral as Orson's head snapped up, his body tensing in anticipation of whatever news she brought. The doctor would like to speak with you. Orson felt his heart stop, time suspending as he searched the nurse's face for some hint of what awaited him, finding nothing in her carefully maintained composure to indicate whether he was about to receive news of life or death. Are they? He began, unable to complete the question, words failing him in a rare moment of complete vulnerability. Gerald had risen at the nurse's entrance, moving to stand behind his son, a hand hovering near Orson's shoulder in an uncharacteristic gesture of support that didn't quite complete itself. Decades of emotional distance making even this moment of crisis insufficient to bridge the gap between them completely. The cesarean was successful, the doctor announced as she entered the waiting room, removing her surgical cap to reveal gray-streaked hair pulled back in a tight bun. You have a healthy boy and girl. They're small, as we would expect with premature twins, but their vitals are strong. Relief washed over Orson in a wave so powerful it nearly buckled his knees, gratitude momentarily overwhelming his customary self-control. The twins were safe, his heirs, the original purpose of the entire arrangement. But his first question revealed how dramatically his priorities had evolved over the months of Faith's pregnancy. And Faith? Miss Juniper, he asked, his voice hoarse with emotions he no longer attempted to disguise. Not from the doctor, not from his father, not even from himself. How is she? The doctor's expression sobered, tempering the good news about the twins with a more cautious assessment of Faith's condition. There were complications, she explained, maintaining direct eye contact with Orson, respecting his evident need for complete honesty rather than false reassurance. Significant blood loss during the emergency procedure. We've stabilized her, and she's receiving transfusions now. She's young and was in excellent health before this pregnancy, which works in her favor, but the next 24 hours will be critical in determining her recovery path. Orson absorbed this information with outward calm, years of business crises having taught him to process bad news without visible reaction. But his hands clenched at his sides betrayed the intensity of his concern, the depth of his investment in Faith's recovery that went far beyond the parameters of their original contract. In the NICU, Orson stood over his children for the first time, gazing down at the tiny beings nested in their separate incubators, surrounded by monitoring equipment that beeped softly in the hushed environment. They were smaller than he had imagined, more fragile, their perfect miniature features bearing subtle combinations of his own characteristics and Faith's. The boy had Orson's straight nose and strong jawline, but Faith's full lips. The girl had Faith's high cheekbones and the same beautiful rich brown skin tone, but Orson's eyes, already showing hints of his deep brown color beneath delicate lids. Their mixed heritage was evident in their features, a perfect blend of his lighter complexion and Faith's deep ebony skin, creating something uniquely beautiful that Orson found himself studying with wonder. The nurse, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and efficient movements, offered to let him hold them once they were cleared for limited physical contact. I don't know how, Orson admitted, the confession coming more easily than it would have months ago, his usual pride in his capabilities superseded by his desire to do right by these vulnerable new lives that depended entirely on others for their care and protection. Like this, the nurse demonstrated with practiced ease, using a doll to show the proper support for a newborn's head and body before preparing Orson's daughter for her first meeting with her father. Despite his initial uncertainty, Orson felt something instinctive take over as the tiny bundle was placed in his arms, his body adjusting to accommodate her minimal weight, his muscles tensing protectively around her delicate form. He stared down at her face, at features still swollen from birth, but undeniably perfect to his newly paternal eyes, and felt something crack in his chest, a sensation both painful and exquisite, as if parts of himself, long frozen, were thawing all at once, overwhelming his emotional systems with feelings he had no framework for processing. Next came his son, equally tiny, equally miraculous, his small hand curling reflexively around Orson's finger with surprising strength for one so small. The physical connection, so simple yet so profound, brought unexpected moisture to Orson's eyes, a vulnerability he would have hidden from anyone watching, but which now seemed an entirely appropriate response to the magnitude of the moment, to the recognition of how completely these children had changed him even before they drew their first breaths. "Have you chosen names?" the nurse asked after Orson had spent time with each twin, her question drawing him back from the wordless communion he had been experiencing with his children. The inquiry caught him off guard. Names had seemed a technicality when he first conceived of this arrangement, something to be decided later, a detail overshadowed by the more pressing concerns of ensuring healthy births and maintaining the businesslike nature of his agreement with Faith. But looking at their faces now, small and perfect, and completely dependent on him, generic placeholders seemed wholly inadequate, disrespectful even to the distinct individuals they already were. Orson's mind went immediately to the stories Faith had shared during their evening conversations, to the parents whose legacy she had fought so hard to preserve through Juniper Organics, whose values and love had shaped the woman who had, against all odds, come to mean so much to him. "Ethan," he said with quiet certainty, looking at his son, then shifting his gaze to his daughter. "And Elena." Faith's parents' names, a tribute to the heritage that would form half of his children's identity, an acknowledgement of the family history that deserved recognition and respect, despite the unusual circumstances of the twins' conception. The choice represented more than mere names. It signified Orson's evolving understanding of what family meant, of the connections that extended beyond biological links to encompass stories and legacies that deserved to be honored and continued. It was also, though he didn't articulate this even to himself, a gesture toward Faith, a silent promise that her contribution to their children's lives would be acknowledged and valued, not erased or minimized, as their original contract might have suggested. Hours passed in a strange limbo of joy and anxiety as Orson divided his time between the NICU, where Ethan and Elena were responding well to treatment, gaining strength with each passing hour, and Faith's room in the ICU, where she remained unconscious following her surgery. Doctors reassured him that her body was healing, that her continued unconsciousness was not unusual, given the trauma and blood loss she had experienced, that she would likely wake when her system was ready. Gerald had returned to the office after seeing the twins, his brief visit marked by an unexpected softening toward his son, a recognition of Orson's transformation that manifested in a gruff but sincere, "They're beautiful, son. You'll be a good father to them," before he departed to handle the business matters Orson had abandoned in his rush to the hospital. On the second night, as he sat beside Faith's bed after checking on the twins one final time before what he expected would be another sleepless night of vigil, Orson finally confronted the truth he'd been avoiding for months. Somewhere between contract negotiations and midnight cravings, between sonogram appointments and quiet conversations, he had fallen in love with Faith Juniper. Not gradually, as romance novels might describe, but in discrete, defining moments. When she had stood her ground during their first meeting, refusing to be intimidated by his power or wealth. When she had slapped him for his cruelty and reminded him of her humanity. When he had found her working late in her makeshift laboratory, her focus and passion for her business revealing a depth of character he couldn't help but admire. When she had placed his hand on her belly to feel the twins move for the first time, her smile in that moment breaking through defenses he had thought impenetrable. And now, as she lay pale and still, connected to machines that monitored her vital signs with soft, persistent beeps, Orson faced the possibility of losing her before he'd ever truly had her, before he'd found the courage to acknowledge what she had come to mean to him. The irony was bitter. He who had insisted on a business arrangement specifically to avoid emotional entanglement, now completely undone by feelings he had neither wanted nor expected. "I need you to wake up," he whispered, taking her hand, his voice rough with emotions he had spent a lifetime suppressing. "The twins need you." He paused, forcing himself to complete the thought, to admit the truth aloud even if she couldn't hear it. I need you, not for the contract, not for appearances, but for all the ways you've changed me, all the parts of myself I never knew existed until you." Faith's fingers twitched in his grasp, the slight movement immediately drawing his attention, his heart rate accelerating as her eyelids fluttered, signs of consciousness returning after hours of stillness. "Orson?" Her voice was weak, raspy from the breathing tube that had been removed earlier that day, but to him it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. Relief coursed through him, momentarily rendering him speechless as he tightened his grip on her hand, his other hand moving instinctively to brush a stray lock of hair from her forehead in a gesture of tenderness neither of them would have imagined possible when they first met. "I'm here," he managed finally, his voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Faith's eyes, still clouded with medication and the lingering effects of anesthesia, searched his face anxiously. "The babies," she began, maternal concern immediate despite her own precarious condition. "Perfect," Orson assured her, unable to keep a smile from spreading across his face, an expression of genuine joy so rare that Faith stared at him in mild surprise despite her weakened state. "Both of them, perfect like their mother." The compliment came naturally, without calculation, a simple truth he no longer had any desire to conceal. Tears filled Faith's eyes, a complex mixture of relief, joy, and something like grief that Orson couldn't fully interpret. "You're not disappointed?" she asked hesitantly, the question catching him off guard. "Disappointed? Why would I be disappointed?" he responded, genuinely confused by her concern, by what could possibly induce her to believe he would feel anything but gratitude and happiness at the successful birth of their children, at her own survival of a dangerous delivery. "The contract. I fulfilled it," Faith explained, her voice still weak but her eyes now focusing more clearly on his face, searching for signs of the business-like detachment that had characterized their early interactions. "You don't need to pretend anymore." The words struck Orson like physical blows, forcing him to confront how completely he had failed to communicate the transformation in his feelings, how thoroughly his previous behavior had convinced Faith that his current attention was mere obligation, or worse, gratitude rather than genuine emotional connection. Of course, she would think that. He had given her every reason to believe their arrangement remained purely transactional, had carefully guarded his evolving feelings behind the professional mask he had perfected over years of business dealings. Even as his heart had softened toward her, he had maintained the outward semblance of detachment, too afraid of his own vulnerability to acknowledge openly how fundamentally she had changed him. "I named them Ethan and Elena," Orson said quietly, choosing to answer indirectly, to demonstrate through actions rather than potentially empty declarations how much Faith had come to mean to him. The significance of the names registered immediately in her expression, surprise giving way to understanding as she recognized her parents' names, the tribute to her family history that Orson had chosen without prompting or expectation. "You remembered," she whispered, fresh tears gathering in her eyes. But these were different, not anxious or grieving, but touched, moved by the unexpected thoughtfulness of his choice, by what it represented about his regard for her heritage, for the stories she had shared during their months together. "I remember everything about you, Faith," Orson admitted, the simple declaration containing multitudes, acknowledgement of how completely she had captured his attention, his interest, eventually his heart, despite all his determined efforts to maintain emotional distance. The moment stretched between them, laden with possibilities neither had anticipated when they signed their carefully worded contract, with feelings that had developed against both their expectations and initial intentions. Faith's eyes began to close again, exhaustion claiming her despite her evident desire to continue their conversation, to explore the implications of Orson's words and actions. "Rest," he told her gently, squeezing her hand once more before releasing it, recognizing her body's need for healing sleep. "The twins and I will be here when you wake up." The promise encompassed more than mere physical presence. It suggested continuity, commitment, a future that extended beyond the parameters of their original arrangement into something neither had anticipated, but which now seemed the only possible path forward. As Faith drifted back into healing sleep, Orson remained by her side, watching over her with an expression of tenderness that would have shocked anyone who knew only his public persona, his mind already turning to how he would demonstrate the depth of his changed feelings Once she was strong enough for the conversation they needed to have, the renegotiation not of a business contract, but of a shared future that had room for all the complex emotions that had developed between them. Chapter 11. Truth and Consequences. Faith's recovery was slow but steady. By the time she was discharged from the hospital a week later, the twins were thriving in the NICU, nearly ready to come home themselves. Orson had transformed the east wing of his house into a proper family space, complete with a state-of-the-art nursery that managed to be both technologically advanced and warmly welcoming. The room featured the hand-painted world map mural they had discussed months ago, custom furniture crafted by artisans, and subtle lighting that could be adjusted to create a soothing environment. Each detail reflected Orson's growing investment in fatherhood, his desire to create a perfect environment for the children who had already transformed his understanding of what mattered most in life. As he helped Faith settle back into her room, an uncomfortable silence hung between them. The boundaries of their arrangement had blurred beyond recognition, but neither knew how to address it directly, how to find words for the complex emotions that had developed during their months together. Faith sat carefully on the edge of her bed, still moving gingerly from the cesarean incision. Orson hovered nearby, uncharacteristically uncertain, wanting to help but unsure of how much assistance Faith would welcome. "What happens now?" she finally asked, her direct gaze meeting Orson's, refusing to allow the crucial conversation to be buried beneath practicalities and logistics. The question encompassed everything: their relationship, their shared parenting of the twins, the future of their unusual family unit, the contract that had brought them together but which no longer seemed adequate. "What do you want to happen?" Orson asked, returning the question rather than imposing his own vision, a notable departure from the man who had dictated all terms of their initial arrangement without room for negotiation. Faith looked away, unable to maintain eye contact for this most vulnerable of admissions. "The contract is fulfilled," she said quietly. "I've given you your heirs. According to our agreement, I should receive the final payment and leave." The words caught in her throat, the clinical language of their contract suddenly inadequate, almost offensive in the face of the profound connection she felt to the twins she had carried for 9 months and to the man who had become something far more significant to her than a business partner. The idea of walking away from Ethan and Elena, of returning to her separate life as if the past 9 months had been merely a business transaction, felt not just painful but almost impossible to contemplate. "Is that all they are to you? Terms of a contract?" Orson asked, his voice sharper than he intended, betraying the depth of his emotional investment in her answer. Faith's eyes flashed as she looked back at him, momentarily angry at the unfair question, at the implication that she viewed the twins as mere business obligations, when every fiber of her being yearned to be part of their lives. "Of course not," she replied with quiet intensity, one hand unconsciously moving to her still tender abdomen. "I carried them for 9 months. I love them." She hesitated, vulnerable in her honesty but unwilling to retreat into emotional distance. "But this was always about business for you, Orson. You made that abundantly clear from the beginning. An heir for your company, a continuation of the King line. Nothing more." Before Orson could respond, Gerald King appeared in the doorway, his arrival as precisely timed as it had been at the hospital to interrupt a crucial moment between his son and Faith. "I hope I'm not interrupting," the older man said, though his tone suggested he didn't particularly care if he was. His attention immediately focused on Faith with an assessing gaze. "I wanted to welcome you home and see how you were recovering." The courtesy sounded rehearsed rather than genuine. Orson tensed visibly, the openness he had been displaying with Faith immediately replaced by the more guarded expression he typically wore in business settings, a shield against vulnerability that Faith had gradually learned to recognize. I understand congratulations are in order, Gerald continued, his gaze taking in the luxurious surroundings. Not just for the successful delivery, but for the substantial payday this arrangement has brought you. I took the liberty of having my associates look into your business. Quite the turnaround in the last 9 months, from bankruptcy to expansion plans. My son's money has served you well. The insinuation was clear, that Faith had engineered the entire arrangement for financial benefit, that her primary motivation remained the money rather than any genuine attachment to the twins or to Orson. The accusation struck at her deepest insecurities about how Orson might perceive her intentions, about the unavoidable fact that financial necessity had indeed been what initially drove her to accept his proposition. "That's enough," Orson said sharply, his tone holding a warning that Faith had never heard him direct toward his father before. Gerald raised an eyebrow at his son's protective response, clearly noting and evaluating this departure from Orson's usual deference in family matters. "Is it? She came to you desperate for cash, Orson," Gerald pressed. "Now she has it, along with 2 king heirs to potentially leverage in the future." Faith felt anger rising within her, not just at the unfair characterization of her motives, but at the casual cruelty of discussing her as if she weren't present. "Get out," she said quietly but with unmistakable authority. Gerald blinked in surprise. "This is my son's house," he began. Faith cut him off. "And these are my children. I won't have them exposed to your poison from day one." Gerald looked to Orson, expecting support. Instead, his son moved to Faith's side, his stance making his allegiance clear. "You heard her, father. Leave." The simple directive contained volumes, not just a request for Gerald to exit the room, but a declaration of independence from the cynical worldview his father had attempted to impose on him. What neither of them knew was that Gerald hadn't immediately left. He had paused in the hallway, overhearing Faith's next vulnerable question. "Is that what you think of me, too? That I planned this? Used you for your money?" The raw emotion in her voice made him pause, reminding him of another voice from decades past. Something shifted in Gerald's perception as he moved away quietly, not enough to erase his suspicions entirely, but sufficient to plant a seed of doubt. After Gerald's departure, the tension in the room remained. Faith stared at her hands, her earlier confidence giving way to uncertainty about what his accusations might have awakened in Orson's mind. "Is that what you think of me too?" she asked quietly. "That I planned this? Used you for your money?" The vulnerability in her question was painful, exposing insecurities she had worked hard to conceal. Orson sat beside her again, closer than before. "No," he replied with certainty. "I know you better than that." The simple declaration contained a recognition of the months they had spent together, of the countless moments of genuine connection that had gradually revealed Faith's character to him, her integrity, her compassion, her fierce dedication to the business that honored her parents' memory. "Do you?" Faith asked, the question direct and unavoidable. "Because sometimes I think you see every woman as a version of your mother waiting to betray you." The accuracy of her observation struck Orson silent. Faith continued, her voice breaking slightly with the weight of emotions she had contained for months. "I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't ask to carry twins, or to nearly die delivering them, or to—" She stopped, the final admission catching in her throat, too vulnerable to voice aloud when she remained uncertain of Orson's own feelings. "To what?" Orson prompted gently, his usual commanding presence softened by genuine concern, by the desire to understand the thoughts she was reluctant to share. Faith met his gaze, vulnerability and defiance warring in her expression as she made the decision to be completely honest. "To fall in love with a man who will never trust me enough to love me back," she said finally, the words rushing out as if she feared her courage might fail if she hesitated. The confession hung in the air between them, changing everything and nothing simultaneously, acknowledging feelings that had been developing for months while leaving unanswered the crucial question of whether those feelings could or would be reciprocated, whether the walls Orson had built could truly be dismantled after decades of careful construction. As Orson helped Faith into the wheelchair that would convey her to her first reunion with Ethan and Elena since their birth, their eyes met in silent communication, in recognition that the conversation they had begun was merely paused, not concluded, that once they had seen their children, once Faith had rested, they would return to the precipice where honesty had led them, to the possibility of a future neither had imagined when they signed their carefully worded contract. For now the twins called them, the miracle of new life temporarily superseding the complex emotional landscape between their parents. But in the gentle way Orson's hands adjusted Faith's blanket, in the protective care with which he guided her wheelchair toward the nursery, there were promises unspoken but deeply felt, indications that whatever came next would bear little resemblance to the cold business arrangement where their journey had begun. Chapter 12. Never Too Late for Forever. Orson stared at Faith, her confession hanging in the air between them. For a man who had built an empire on calculated risks, he found himself without words, stripped bare by her declaration of love. "You love me?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper, decades of disbelief that anyone could truly love him behind the question. Faith's courage faltered. "In 2 weeks, once the twins come home, I'll be gone," she said, each word carefully measured. "The final payment will clear, and you can raise your heirs without the complication of their mother." The slight tremor in her voice betrayed the heartbreaking beneath her composure. "Is that what you want?" Orson asked, his commanding tone replaced by uncertainty. Faith met his eyes, her own shimmering with unshed tears. "What I want stopped mattering the moment I signed your contract." Orson moved closer, taking her hand with unexpected gentleness. "It matters to me. You matter to me, Faith. More than business, more than legacy, more than anything I ever thought important. Don't say things you don't mean just because I survived or because I gave you children," Faith said, one tear escaping down her cheek. "I don't need your gratitude, Orson. I fulfilled my contract." "I named our children after your parents," he said, thumb tracing patterns across her knuckles, "because I wanted them to carry your heart, your history." His voice grew rough with emotion. "I stayed by your bed for 3 days because a world without you was unimaginable. I've spent 9 months falling in love with you, fighting it because I was terrified of needing someone again." "You hurt me," Faith whispered, "when you were afraid." "I know," he acknowledged, the admission costing his pride. "I was cruel when I felt vulnerable. I pushed you away when all I wanted was to hold you closer." His voice broke. "I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm asking for it anyway. I'm asking for the chance to spend my life showing you the man I can be, the man you helped me become." "What exactly are you proposing?" Faith asked, hope cautiously blooming. Orson smiled genuinely. "I think I'm proposing," he said, withdrawing a small velvet box containing an emerald ring that matched her eyes. "I don't want our arrangement anymore, Faith. I want a marriage built on trust and respect, and a love I never believed I could feel." Faith touched the ring but didn't take it. "How do I know this isn't temporary? That you won't see betrayal around every corner again?" "You don't," Orson answered honestly. "Just as I don't know loving you won't leave me vulnerable. But for the first time, the possibility of joy outweighs every fear I've used to protect myself." Faith needed time. The twins are coming home, and we'll be learning to be parents. Let's not rush from one arrangement to another without being certain. Orson closed the box gently. "I'll wait," he promised. "Some things are worth waiting for." 3 weeks later, the King household pulsed with new life. Faith had established a corner of the nursery where she remotely managed Juniper Organics, now flourishing internationally. One evening, as Orson rocked Ethan to sleep, he looked up to find Faith watching from the doorway, love undisguised in her eyes. "You're good with him," she said softly. "I had an excellent teacher," Orson replied. Faith moved into the room, checking on Elena before facing him. "I've been thinking about your proposal." Orson's heart quickened. "And?" Faith smiled radiantly. "I'd like to propose a lifetime contract, with regular reviews and the option to renew indefinitely." Orson placed Ethan in his crib, then crossed to Faith, taking her hands in his. In the soft glow of the nursery lights, they stood as equals at last, no longer CEO and surrogate, but a man and woman who had found love in the most unexpected place. "Those terms are acceptable," he said, voice rich with emotion. "Do we have a deal, Ms. Juniper?" Faith rose on tiptoes, pressing her lips to his in answer. Against her mouth, he whispered, "I'll take that as a yes." For a man who couldn't trust and a woman who wouldn't give up, it had never been just about giving him a baby to save her business. In the end, they had saved each other,